Good morning to Jakarta. Can you hear me? Great. There's a little delay on the sound, so I can hear myself speaking, but I'll try to do my best. Can you put on so I can see the slides? Or how is it? Because then we'll start. Okay, good morning. I will this morning talk about how I will show you a project with a student's course about tangible prototyping, and I will also briefly show you a poster process that we did for the World Graphic Designers. This is because we're going to talk a little bit about how do you do ideas, how do you get them, and there's no specific way in doing it. So I will only show you a few ways of doing it, but remember there's a lot of possibilities in making ideas. So this is only one way, and you, of course, as students, have to find your own way doing it. Some will do it by sketching by hand, some will work digitally. There's no right or wrong in doing things, but you have to find your way. So I'm going to show you some few examples. Next slide. Just briefly introducing myself. I'm a graphic designer. I'm educated as a graphic designer. I have a master in graphic design, and I also have a theoretical master in design, which is kind of not a PhD, but a level of a PhD. This is my website, and if you want to see more about what I'm doing visually, this is the website, and also it links to my social media and things like that. Okay, just next slide. This is a project I've been doing. As I told you, you can sketch by hand, but it's also a possibility to sketch in material. And this was for an exhibition. It's a letter. If you take next slide. You can see it's made out of actually candy. It's candy in Denmark. It's small shoes. Next slide. The next slide. And yeah, just to show you some of the things I do. But you can go, as I said, on my website and see more. So let's talk about experimentation. Next slide. And next. According to the Cambridge Academy dictionary, experimentations is the process of trying methods, activities to discover what effect they have. Because sometimes when we have a problem or a task we're going to solve, we have to do some idea generation, we have to sketch, but also what I think is really important is just to do some experimentations. When you do experimentations, there's no guarantee that you will do a perfect idea, but you will get some knowledge, you will get some further ideas that you can use. So what I'm going to show you now and talk about is a student's course. Next slide. We're talking about tangible prototyping as a tool for idea generation. What is tangible prototyping? It's making things by hand in materials. Next slide. So this is an example. This is from a workshop in Mexico I did some years ago, and they were sketching letters by hand in materials. The method that we use, next slide, it's called the experimenter. And experimenter means it's a method that the design studio IDEO is using. Experimenter means it's a role that a given innovator can choose to play. Next slide. Experimenters don't need to be geniuses. Sometimes you think you have to be really clever to get good ideas. No, it's not about being a genius. It's about being curious. It's very important to be curious. Next slide. Experimenters share a passion for hard work, a curious mind, and an openness to serendipity. This is from a book wrote by David Kelly in 2005 about innovation. So next slide. So what we're going to talk about is, of course, you can make ideas by thinking and sketching them. But in this exercise, we actually turned this phrase around and said, if you take next slide, making is thinking. You can also get ideas by making things. So next slide. This is some of the ideas the students did in typography. We were asking them to do sketches, 4 letters words. Next slide. Just to see what they could do by using the materials that are in their surroundings. Next slide. So this is about experimentation. This is about playing, and also just to use your curiosity to see what you can do. If you take the next few slides, just continue. You can see here they put water into this sink and something is happening. So this is a way of using experimentation, creating ideas by sketching with material and making ideas. And what they did is they worked really, really fast. So don't think too much, just do things and discover what the materials can do for you. And sometimes it gives you certain gifts. And one other thing that is really important is to do a lot of sketches. Don't only do 1 or 2 or 3 sketches, do 50 or do 100, because then you have, and I guarantee you will at least have 1 or 2 ideas that are really, really brilliant. But if you only do 1 or 2, how do you know that this is the best ideas? You have to do more. Maybe number 2 is the best idea. How do you know if you don't try to do more? So what I'm going to show you now is a small film done by some of my students. It's some of the works, and it's a little movie in 2-3 minutes, but just to give you an idea of all the possibilities and materials you could use to make ideas. So please, next slide, and put on the video. There should be sound as well.
As I go to anywhere I flow, sometimes I believe, at times I'm rational. I can fly high, I can go low. Today I got a million, tomorrow I don't know. Decisions as I go to anywhere I flow. Sometimes I believe, at times I'm rational. I can fly high, I can go low. Today I got a million, tomorrow I don't know. Stop claiming what you own and think about the show. We're all playing the same game, waiting on alone. We're unknown and known, special when I clone. Hate will make you cautious, love will make you grow. Make me feel the warmth, make me feel the cold. It's written in our stories, written on the walls. This is our call, we rise and we fall. Dancing in the moonlight, don't we have it all? As I go to anywhere I flow. Sometimes I believe, at times I'm rational. I can fly high, I can go low. Today I got a million, tomorrow I don't know. Make me feel the warmth, make me feel the cold. It's written in our stories, written on the walls. This is our call, we rise and we fall. Dancing in the moonlight, don't we have it all?
Yes, so just to give you an idea, this was a course, it's 24 hours. The students had to do 50 sketches in order to work fast and to do experimentations. and use their curiosity. And also what is really, really important, and it's connected to creativity, it's to play. Play with materials, play with your ideas, and see what you can get from it. From these sketches, we use them to develop posters, cover design, all kinds of ideas. The main point in this is also, this is the students' own original ideas. Because one of the things that we also see a lot, also in education, it's very easy to go on Google something, and then use other designers' idea. So by this, when you're doing tangible prototyping and when you do experimentations, you also develop your own language and your own original ideas, which is quite important. So, next slide. This is a poster process I'm going to show you that we did for the World Graphic Designers. This was a poster about education. And I did this collaboration together with a Mexican designer called Aram Huerta. And also one of the things that is really, really nice, sometimes you work alone, but it's also nice to work with other designers or your classmates because you learn from each other. So next slide. This is just an example of the idea generation. Because, and also to get an idea for you, this is a model done by Saunders and Strappers. It's a model from one of the papers in 2007. And it shows the design process. Because as a student, it's important to understand when you have a task or you have a problem, there are certain steps you have to go through to get the final product or your final idea. And in the beginning, as you can see, there's this fuzzy front end. Everything is a mess and there's a lot of ideas and you don't know really what to do with it. But there's different methods that you can use. One of them I just showed you was doing tangible prototyping to move your process. But it's important in the beginning also that you do some research about who is your client, what are they aiming for, who is your target group, what are they dreaming of, what do you want to communicate. Do a lot of research to figure out what is the main issue in this task or this problem. And then you move on to generate ideas, do a lot of ideas, as I told you. And then you narrow it more down, you start developing a concept. You start making prototype. That could be to do different kinds of posters. And then in the end, you get to the final product and your final solution. So this is what you have to do. Now I'll just go through this process that we did developing this poster for the World Graphic Designers on education. And can I just ask the man who's making the slides, just go through them gently and then I'll explain on the way, because it's a long process, but just for you as a student to give you an idea of this is how we developed the poster and the process and how many steps you go through, sketching and talking and research and things like that. So next slide, and then just continue slowly going through. So we did mind map, and then you went to doing research about, because it was about education, looking into what kind of symbols could we find for mind and mindset. Next slide. Next slide. This is different educations. And then, of course, also because Aram, the Mexican designer, is not speaking proper English. So we did this kind of communication between us in Spanish, English, discussing what do we want to do. So sometimes we sketch using mind maps and mood boards, and then also talking about what do we want to go. Next slide. So just going through what do we think. Next slide. Trying to figure out what is the purpose of our poster. What do we want to do? And this one we wanted to do a more timeless poster, but it has to nurture the communication of knowledge and to educate. Next slide. So this is Aram making some research about some of the elements we could use. Next slide. Also some research from Aram. Next slide. Looking into what kind of style should we use, what kind of inspiration could we get from fiction films, or what kind of aesthetics should we use. Next slide. Also looking into composition. So this is all the part of research. It's not about the idea yet. This next slide. I work completely in a different way. I'm not that organized as Ram. I do a lot of sketches. I don't do nice sketches because it's not important to have nice sketches. It's important that your sketches is helping you to get direction for your idea. So this is some of the ideas just made by ink in my sketchbook. Next slide. And next slide, showing some of the ideas. And then I sent these to Aram. Next slide. And Aram was working on top of my sketches, and he's working in the computer. So next slide. Next slide. And this is an example how he took one of my sketches and he developed it to his expression. Next slide. And he did it with some of our sketches. Next slide. And next slide. He did this sketch and we were talking about, this was quite nice because we like the way that the head has some kind of arms like an octopus. So we were looking into more images of an octopus to look how does it look. Next slide. So we're always going back and forth from the sketchbook and looking into images on the computer or in books to develop our idea. Next slide. So this is some of the ideas developing. Next slide. This is one of mine. I often also take just photos and then I sketch on top of them. So this is one of the images we were talking about. That could be a good way of making our poster. So next slide. So we had a lot of different ideas, and then you have to choose which one are you going to work with. Next slide. So we narrowed the process down, and we were talking about the brain and the octopus was a nice idea to communicate education. Next slide. So this is some of the process showing some of the sketches we had. We're looking into also, next slide, some other possibilities, discussing if they were good or not. Next slide. So we were discussing, then you have to stop as a designer, figure out, okay, what do we actually want to do? Next slide. So this is one of the sketches, giving a direction. Next slide. And then figure out how should the expression in the poster look like, or the visual image. Next slide. And this one we thought, okay, this is more like we want to do. And then you start hunting the real visual image you want to have. Next slide. So you can see there's a thumbs up on the left side on the poster. We were going for that one. Next slide. And then we were narrowing more down, okay, how can we communicate the different, how do you say, for education, what kind of tools, or should it be a key, or is education the key to everything? And we want the arms to have some kind of fingers or key or whatever, or a plug or tool. So we were looking into the octopus arms. Next slide. This is some sketches from Aram, sketching the octopus arm. And then we were discussing them. Next slide. Different opportunities. Next slide. And of course, we're just discussing what works. And next slide. And again, I was sketching on his ideas and making these sketches. Should it be a plug or should it be a key? Next slide. This was on a meeting to Copenhagen, and I always have my sketchbook with me, and you as students should too. Always have your sketchbook, always do sketches when you have ideas. So this is a sketch. Next slide. Looks like this, and this was one of the sketch you said, okay, this is what we want to do. And then again, you go more into details. How should the key look like? How should the keyholes look like? Next slide. Investigating different keyholes. How do they look visually? And next slide. Putting them into the poster as well, looking into the typography. Next slide. And Aram was doing this to see, should it be like this, the head with the octopus arms and a key holding it. Next slide. This is done on a computer. Next slide. And then we were thinking again, discussing, okay, what do we want? Next slide. These are three different, and main idea is there, but it doesn't really, we didn't like the visuals. So next slide. We were looking into ancient graphic and looking for faces. So this is again expressions. Next slide. And next slide. And this was more like what we wanted. One head from the side and one from the front. And then you start working in black and white. Next slide. Try to figure out how should the composition be. And then also we added colors. Next slide. This is more cold. And then you start doing different kinds of color variations. Next slide. And this was Aram doing this. And then I took one of the sketches. Next slide. Tried to do different variations as well. Next slide. Next slide. And then next slide. And then you gradually getting to more of a solution that we want. Next slide. And this is actually the right one is the final one. So again, we always, next slide. We print. Can you take next slide? We print the posters in black and white to see if the composition is working. I'm just using a cheap black and white printer to see how does it work. And then, right, this is the final poster, how we did it. The next slide. Yes, so this is the final one. So this is to give you an idea of how we work with the process, how we get from idea generations, working in computers, sketching in books, back and forth, developing on each other's idea. And then I have a last poster I will show you too. It's very short. This is one I just recently did. Next slide. And next slide. For a poster for an exhibition in Ecuador. The exhibition was not a fairy tale. The brief was to choose a fairy tale and make a poster on the topic plastic in the ocean. And I, because I come from Denmark, and we have a very famous fairy tale writer called Hans Christian Andersen. Next slide. This is Hans Christian Andersen, and he wrote this fairy tale about, next slide, the ugly duckling. Maybe you know it, but the ugly duckling fairy tale, the ugly duckling gets away from his original mother, and then he goes into a dog family, and he grows up there, and the other small ducklings are teasing him because he's gray and he's ugly, and when he grows up, he turns to this beautiful swan. Next slide. So I used that as an inspiration, and I, because the main headline was not a fairy tale, the story about plastic is actually the opposite. That when plastic was invented in 1950s, it was a kind of miracle and a really, really good product, and we used it everywhere. And as it turns out now, we can see that it's the way we treat it by not recycling it or just putting it into the ocean is actually quite a disaster. So this is the opposite story of the ugly duckling, and this is made also tangible. It's I did a lot of sketches. I'm not going to show that, but I'm just showing you the tangible, the physical one. So next slide. This is made by plastic spoons, and then I use a camera and I took pictures of it. And next slide, and take it into Photoshop and then adjust it and make the corrections in colors. And next slide. This is the final one. And now I have to ask about the time. Are we out of time now, or how is it going?
All right, your time is up, Rikke. Sorry.
Yeah, my time is up. Yes, I thought so. So I'll just stop here.
Yes.
But I hope.
Yes, all right. Thank you, Rikke.
Say in the end.
I'm sorry?
Yes. Could I just sum up just quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Just for the students, I hope that this is giving you an idea. When you have a problem or a task you have to solve, do a lot of sketches, make a lot of ideas, and then you turn them into concepts and in order to get your final solution. And I hope showing you the process of the poster we did, that it gives you an idea that you're not going from a problem and then jumping directly to an idea. You have to go through a process. You have to do a lot of investigations. You have to be curious. You have to do a lot of tests to figure out what your right solution should be. So that will be my final word. So thank you for listening.